So, all right. So today we're going to talk about political parties and elections. And yeah, I'm the teacher here now, so that's me. Y'all are seeing you see Angry Cat on your screen? Does everybody see
Yeah.
Angry Cat?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So this is kind of how I feel about our elections sometimes, right? The elections, I hope they all lose, right? And then this other one here, I like putting memes on there to tell you how I feel about stuff or how kids usually feel about it. It's like, welcome to America, where everybody complains about the two-party system and nobody votes third party. And so, kind of what we're dealing with this week is kind of like, why do we end up feeling that way, kind of thing, right? So I'm clearly not Miss Kaiser. So who am I? What are we doing here, right? So first of all, and I already answered this to Andrew before some of y'all got in here. Um, I've actually was hired here to teach math, but I'm really more of a social studies teacher. My background is I studied history in college and social studies in my master's. I'm working on a PhD in history. But when they hire people, they tend to hire their math positions first. And because I'm math and social studies certified, um, I end up getting hired for math every time I've ever tried to, you know, get a new job. So there you go. So in other words, I do know a lot about this subject. It's one that I enjoy a lot. And because we have only 2 weeks left in this class, I'm not going to try to redesign this one. I presume most of y'all are y'all, is everybody in here in econ next 9 weeks? I would guess. Is that how it works? Y'all know? Yes, no, maybe.
What was that?
Do y'all have econ next 9 weeks? Or okay, seven says we don't know. So I
I'm not
think
sure.
that the way this usually works is that y'all will go from government to econ, so economics, and so I'll teach that class too, which will be fun. I've never actually taught economics before, so that one it kind of is math and social studies mixed together in a way. So that'll be fun. So I'm not going to try to like redesign stuff the last couple weeks, especially because there's a gazillion things of planning, that I have to do and so forth and so on. So y'all just kind of bear with me on giving you your feedback on your grades and stuff. I'm gonna get it done, but you know, and maybe be patient with me, I guess. All right. Um, so what we're working on today is explain the process for electing officials in the U.S. and the role of political parties in the process. So I'm going to build on the tutorial thing. That's what I know she was doing. So I didn't want to redesign what she was doing for the last couple of weeks. I'm going to try to make it meaningful and useful to life and understanding the world. So hopefully you won't feel like you wasted your time for being here. Okay. Now I know she was checking for people's attendance like right now, in terms of, saying hello or something like that. I'm going to do it by asking you a question sometime during the lesson. And if you don't answer, I don't think you're here. So there you go. All right. I'm not going to say a whole lot on this, but I do need to remind you that this is a quarter course. So you got to be done through by October 1st. I will say I need you to narrow any target time down for this class to Tuesday, Thursday, because I'm teaching live for this class and then for math directly afterwards. And I have a math target time every day at 12. So if we can do Tuesday, Thursday, I'll leave that open for you guys on Tuesday, Thursday, because I think that's probably all y'all will need at this point. You're either doing your work or you're not, right? Um, and then notice here's my email is here, and there's my Google Voice number. So you can kind of send me the message on there. I would just say, if I was you, I'd probably send me a message on that Google Voice thing or Canvas inbox. All right. Okay, great. Enough of that stuff. All right, this week we got a tutorial reading and a mastery quiz like she's been doing. And then there is a Unit 3 summative test that will be posted on Canvas. If you fail that one and you need to retake it, this is one thing I will do differently. I don't know what she did on this, but if you need a retake on the major test, I'm going to give you some kind of essay questions to write down your thoughts on, or reflections on the questions before I reassign that. So there's that. All right. And then also the test questions on this she gave me the questions for the part she taught last week, and then this week's tutorials and what I teach today and Wednesday. All right. All right. So here we are. So political parties, history of political parties. All right. So I got my meme of George Washington over here. He's like, guys, I said don't create political parties. You had literally one job, bruh, you blew it, right? And so a political party is the fancy like dictionary definition is it's a formally constituted political group, typically operating on a national basis that contests elections and attempts to form or take part in government. So basically, a party, the funny kind of definition of this is, you go to a restaurant and they're like, my family's Carter and there's six of us. So it's like Carter party is six, right? And so party just means a group that's united in common interest. Okay. So what we're looking at today is what are political parties and why were the founders of our country worried about them? And I think you can see probably now why they were worried about them. Pretty smart set of guys, honestly. All right. So a political party is a group with a common interest, right? They organize to try to get power, win elections, and determine the policy and influence the direction of the country, right? Now, the U.S., we generally have two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and a winner-take-all system. All right. Now, what that's used, you'll see in the reading you're working on your Ed Minum, is that if you have a parliamentary system like Britain has, a lot of times what they will have is, let's say you get a certain party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats. And so if you think about, say, a Libertarian Party or Green Party in the United States, then if you had a system like that, then if those guys got 10% of the vote, they would get 10% of the congressman or congresswoman, right? But we don't have that. So that's why we end up with two parties winning almost all the time, right? So I'm going to show you an example of how that ends up working out in two of our states. Okay, so one is a Democratic state, and one's Republican. Because I'm not trying to be like biased on one party or the other here. That's not really my job. So here's Illinois. Okay, this is last year's election. So in Illinois, last year there were 14 Democratic seats and 3 Republican seats because they designed the map. Their term for this is gerrymandered. Okay, now I don't think that was actually. I'm not sure if y'all ran across this term or not. I didn't check everything, but the term gerrymander, it actually refers to an old governor of Massachusetts. But you see how they drew all these little funky lines right here? Well, what they did there was they made it to where all the Republican votes are dumped into two or these 3 districts here. And so they won a whole bunch of those. But then the Democrats were able to pull 14 seats to 3. So the Democrats hold 82% of the seats in Illinois, even though they only won 56% of the vote. So 56-44, because even if you win a district by 1 vote, you win the district, right? Reverse example of this is Florida. It's not really quite as extreme, but it's still kind of, just shows you that both sides will do this. So in Florida in the last election, Republicans won 20, Democrats won 8, right? Even though Florida was 58% Republican vote and Democrats were basically 40%. And so basically each district right here, as drawn by these lines, is winner take all. So if you win by 1 vote, you win that district. Okay, so that's basically one of the, I guess, whatever, it is what it is, but that's how our electoral system works, right? So now let's go through a little bit of a background of the U.S. party system. Okay, so in the very beginning, right, once the Constitution passed, we had Washington's elected president, and there was like no parties at that point, kind of, although there were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The first political parties really become the Federalists versus the Republicans of the 1790s. And the Republicans there are usually called the Democratic Republicans. They're not today's Republican Party. I'll get to where they were in a minute. The Federalists were really more about a stronger central or national government. All right. And so they would interpret the Constitution in a way that would give the national government more power. And we're really trying to focus on developing the country and investing in infrastructure and commerce and manufacturing and trade ties with Britain and generally order and stable government. Whereas the Republicans, Democratic Republicans, that's more of like the Jefferson group, right? They wanted to keep most of the power for the states, right, and for individuals, and tended to more sympathize with France. All right. Now, the Federalists won most of the elections early on. So you had Washington and then Adams. And then Hamilton was really the one kind of running the party behind the scenes for the most part during that time. So Jefferson wins the 1800 election, and the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, take power. And they keep power with them versus the Federalists. And then the Federalists kind of fall off and stop being a major party after 1812 because of some issues with the War of 1812 and so forth. Okay, so the Democratic Republicans are the only party until 1828. All right, so the true split is going to come in 1828, but you can already kind of see the divide in 1824. All right, where you had Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who was from Tennessee, but was actually born, if you know, like the Fort Mill area up there, Catawba area of, up near Charlotte. That's where he was born. All right. So you had, this is the electoral votes from 1824. So Jackson probably should have won, but all the other guys gave their votes to Adams, John Quincy Adams, in order to basically allow him to become president. All right. So basically here, what I'm getting at is that the divide is clearly already happening at this point. All right. Now, 1828, Andrew Jackson is going to split the Democrats, right? Which this is where we start using the modern term Democrats in splitting them off from the Democratic Republicans. So then that the people who are not the Democrats basically start calling themselves Whigs, which goes back to the English term. Okay. So the Whigs were going to be the ones that were kind of more like the old Federalists, right? They favored tariffs, meaning taxes on imports, more internal improvements, the American system. The leader of that was Henry Clay, who was never elected president, became close like 5 times. All right. They supported the Bank of the United States, whereas the Democrats under Jackson were like, no, that's not legal. You can't do that. All right. They were more states' rights, less big government. Then, of course, you have Andrew Jackson, who wanted to remove the Cherokee west of the Mississippi River. Even though the court system said you can't do that, he did it anyway. Right. So Andrew Jackson, not one of my favorites. Right. Now, what ends up happening in the 1850s is that you had the divides going on over slavery. So the Whig Party ends up divided over slavery, which then leads to the Republican Party, which emerges basically in opposition to the expansion of slavery. Now, it becomes known as an anti-slavery party, but that wasn't originally, it was originally just against the expansion of slavery. All right. And the Whig Party then falls apart. And then in 1860 and on, we end up with the Democrats and Republicans, which has not changed since then. Okay. Now, what has changed is what the two parties stand for, and they've kind of flipped on some things. All right. So the Republicans dominated most of the late 1800s, won most of the presidential elections. So what I mean by sectionalism is different sections of the country supported different people. So the Republicans were getting their support from the business people, the North, the Midwest, and then the Democrats were getting their support from the South and from the really poor and the new immigrants in the North. Right. Now, the Democrats, I will point out, were the ones who were trying to keep blacks from voting and were passing all the restrictive, like poll taxes and all this kind of stuff, and grandfather clause and all these things that were making it where less and less people could vote in the South. Right. And that's how the Democrats were gaining and keeping control. All right. Now, Republicans still mostly dominate all the way up until the start of the Great Depression, with the exception of when Woodrow Wilson won in 1912 and 1916. The 1912 one is a really interesting one that I would encourage you to look into. The Republican Party actually split that time, okay, because Theodore Roosevelt was a very popular Republican leader. He had said that he wasn't going to run again in 1908. So his buddy William Howard Taft became president as a Republican, did a lousy job. So Roosevelt decided to come back and challenge him. And so that actually split the Republican vote, allowing the Democrats to win, even with not the majority of the vote. Anyway, beside the point, the sectional voting patterns I said continue, with the South being the Democratic stronghold. All right, now the party alignments really start to change due to the New Deal. Okay, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, creates what we call the New Deal coalition of the poor, and the working class that was the basis of the Democratic Party really for the rest of the 20th century. All right, so the Democrats are going to win both president and Congress for 20 straight years, starting during the Depression through World War II and early into the Cold War. All right, so through Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Right now, another part of the party realignment is going to happen with Lyndon Johnson, who's urged by civil rights groups, Martin Luther King, right, all that sort of thing, to get civil rights legislation passed. And then the African Americans get the right to vote protected, and then they shift to voting with Democrats, right, at this point, right, which is still mostly holding today at about a 90% rate. All right, now Republicans make a shift, and this is in the reading that you have a little bit, to more conservative views starting in the late 1960s, because the Republicans realized that their previous ideology and the way they were thinking wasn't kind of holding together really consistently. So they moved to a smaller government and protecting basic, kind of Judeo-Christian values from the founding of the United States, First and Second Amendments being the famous ones, right, and so forth. All right. The Democrats became focused on the government being responsible to provide for the welfare of the people and providing lots of government programs that started with the New Deal programs and continue to create more and more bigger government programs to protect the welfare of the people, right? So basically, then also the Democrats with this began to be more responsive to the demands of different, what we call identity groups, and protecting those identity groups' views, which started with ethnic and racial minorities, then to women's groups, then to they argue in favor of abortion and LGBT issues. And so those are the things that modern Democratic Party has become known for, while the Republicans have kind of shifted more towards conservative views, conservative values, smaller government, and kind of protecting the original individual rights of the Bill of Rights, kind of, right? So that's kind of where we are in terms of the policies today. So really the shift was kind of in the 1960s. All right. And accordingly, party sectionalism has also shifted. So the South is now solidly Republican for the most part, which is a complete flip of where it was before the 1960s. And then the Northeast and the West Coast are Democratic. So basically, you're going to have a Republican presidential candidate has zero chance of winning Massachusetts or California. Right, and a Democratic candidate has zero chance, frankly, of winning South Carolina or Alabama. Right, that's just how it is. Right, the new division that has developed recently, and this is where I'm seeing this in my lifetime. So I'm 39. So since I've become an adult, what's really shifted is Democrats are now supported by more highly educated, like college graduates and people in urban city areas, whereas the Republicans are shifting more towards rural, like, in the countryside and just on the outside suburbs and the poor and the middle class. And so the class shift is what's happening right now. And if that continues, that kind of will threaten to pull away some of the poor, like the poor and the middle class support the working class that the Democrats were based off of. So that's kind of the dynamic we're dealing with right now. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with the term populism, but there's kind of the competition over the populism, whether or not the Republicans are moving that way or not. So a point to consider here, just as you're considering how you're thinking about politics and voting and so forth, is which of these groups that we're talking about controls access to information and how it's presented and biased. And I would tell you that ultimately the Democratic Party and the educated intellectual elites are the ones that control most of our access to information and control our social media and so forth. And you got to understand that there is a certain element of that is very influential in people's thinking. Right. So I don't care who you vote for, just know that you're voting on your values as opposed to somebody, putting stuff into your mind. All right. Now, this is a kind of a funky map here. But what I want you to see from this is basically how things have shifted over time. So this map right here starts in 1960. All right, so this was the Richard Nixon versus John F. Kennedy. So if you notice, Kennedy won this in a close election here, and basically his support is going to be a lot of the South and then some of the Northeast because he was a Roman Catholic and won that vote up in the Northeast. Then in '64, you had Lyndon Johnson winning in a pretty popular manner. But then notice here what started to happen was there was a flip. All right, in the South went Republican for the first time. All right, then '68, you got basically George Wallace running as a anti-civil rights type person, won the deep South. All right, and then you had basically a funny mess of voting going on there. You got Vietnam going on too, so that's kind of a funky map. Then you had in '72, Richard Nixon won in a landslide, which, oddly enough, he felt the need to be cheating on, spying on his opponents, which clearly from this map you can see he didn't really need any help from spying on his opponents. So that's where Watergate scandal and him resigning comes in. But when you see that map, you're like, bro, why did you even bother to cheat? Like you were going to win anyway, right? He was just real neurotic and worried about everything, and you know caused him to do stupid and criminal things. Then '76 is kind of one where it goes back to some previous patterns because Jimmy Carter was a Democrat from Georgia, and a lot of people in the South thought he was going to be more representative of the Southern interest, but turns out he was more of a liberal Democrat than they thought, which is why you see 1980, Jimmy Carter only held his home state of Georgia plus a few other states, and Reagan won. Then you're going to see, I think Reagan really solidifies the split off towards the modern politics that we see, where Reagan wins almost everything in '84, and then George Bush, the first George Bush, holds most of that in '88. '92, you get a funky election because Clinton was from Arkansas and was kind of more Southern focused, so he pulled a few more Southern states there. In '96, you start to see the solid, Republican South emerging here, even in election Clinton won. Then 2000, you see George Bush in 2004 holds all of that South and the Great Plains and all of that, and you see that emerge all the way through, right? And so that's kind of the pattern you're seeing there. If you take, say, the 2012 election that was won by Obama, but it was a pretty evenly divided one, you kind of see the pattern of what we're seeing now is emerging there, which is the most of the South and this upper kind of Midwest being Republican, the coast are being Democratic. And then where the real battlegrounds are is your Pennsylvania, your Wisconsin. Georgia has actually become a very big battleground in recent years due to some demographic shifts there. Florida has become pretty unwinnable for Democrats at this point. And then, Colorado moved from being Republican to being unwinnable for Republicans, as has Virginia. And then I would say Arizona and Georgia are both in the toss-up category at this point. Iowa has moved very conservative and is now pretty much Republican in elections also. All right, so that's kind of a overview of the parties, right, and how our elections have gone. I think I made this lesson a little shorter than I meant to, but I'm used to I've taught social studies for a number of years, but I've never taught it in an online only setting. So, in this, I don't have to like stop and tell people to quit talking and that kind of, stuff that wastes a lot of time. So what I want you to do real quickly is tell me you're here by doing the following. Okay. In my little chat thing, I want you to tell me one thing that you learned today about the history of political parties in the US, and then type me a question really quickly that you have about the parties still. Okay. And we're not out of time. So I would actually like to see, what comes up to you right here that maybe we can discuss for a few minutes before we go that will be beneficial to you. Okay. So type those two things in really quickly, and then let's see what we can discuss with our last kind of 10 minutes. And I'll get you out of here by about 9:40 probably. Tell me what you learn and what you think is still a question for you. All right, so don't see any questions yet. So that seems that no one has any. So one of the things that I also wanted to do, here we go. Here's one. Um, yeah, it is possible. And I would say for the parties to switch, um, I would say that there are certain things where certain ones can switch, and then certain ones are just flat out not going to. Um, okay, gotcha. Um, so one of the things I think is can make election and learning about this more fun is I taught seventh grade history for a long time, but this is one that I actually really like this game. Okay, so I sent y'all a link to a game that I honestly think would help you to learn about our presidential elections in a way that is honestly super fun. Okay. And that I think you can pretty easily justify yourself doing because it will really help you understand um, how our elections work. All right. So let me show you, I'm going to show you this and then I'll come back to this real quick. Um, so I put on your in your weekly checklist thingy a link, a list of links and things that I thought were really interesting. And so, I mean, there's some like boring you have to learn by studying and all that, right? But then sometimes one of the cool things about government is you can actually learn stuff by playing games. Okay. And so this game right here, I sent you all a link on this. It's called Win the White House. And what it does is you decide which party you want to be, what issues you want to stand for, and then you have to like campaign, and it kind of shows you how the campaigns work, which is actually what we're talking about on Wednesday. And then you kind of see what it takes to win an election in terms of getting the electoral votes. And I think it's like super fun and super like instructive at the same time. So I would encourage you to play that. There's also an app version of it. So like I have an iPad and I played it a number of times on the iPad. And so I think it's fun all the way from like middle schoolers up to adults. So I would say look at that and tell me if give me your feedback on it later. But I think this is a really fun app that can help you with that. I also posted y'all like several other links, most of which are going to deal more with what we're doing on Wednesday. But hopefully you'll look at some of those. I think it's pretty interesting and fun to do. All right, and so just kind of finishing up here. Um, Next time we're going to talk about why a two-party system can actually be dangerous, right? In terms of like what are some concerns with that? And then what is our electoral system like in terms of presidential elections, all right, in terms of congressional elections, how are they different, right? That kind of stuff. And then how is public opinion, right? The opinion and how are we influenced, and then how do people measure that? All right. And then I can also leave it on for a couple of minutes to see what questions you have about grades, any of your work, etc. All right. So I'll kind of leave it on for a couple minutes. But otherwise, I think we're about done. I talk faster than I think I do, so you're good to go as soon as assuming you have no more questions.